So, dude, it's been a minute. You first came on my show a long time ago, and you didn't have that many followers. I think you just dropped your book. Um, then I saw your career completely because that's how it is, man. You bring up the proof of work in Bitcoin. Work speaks for itself. People acknowledge it. People see it, and it doesn't matter what your skin color is, where you're from, right? People judge you just on your work, right? And I think you were telling me at the time that you were living at your mom's house while you were writing this book. It was a long time ago. So, what has changed in your life? Has everything changed? Has your perspective changed? You've went on the Peter McCormack podcast. You know that podcast gets hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of listens and views. Talk to me. Talk to me about your
Yeah,
experience.
man. It's been a ride, and I completely agree. I was definitely amazed at just how, the proof of work aspect of the industry and just how quickly people will bring you up and how quickly people will point towards good work. And yeah, when I was writing the book, I was just like thinking through scenarios. It's like, okay, like I'm going to self-publish this thing. I didn't really want to go after a publishing deal or anything like that. I was like, if I do that, I know that it's, number one, they get a lot more control over the book and they're going to make it something that is going to be much more easier for them to market in a lot of ways. If I even got the deal, and then there's all the legwork that you have to put in just to get there. And I was like, I don't really want it to be that. I just want it to be whatever I want it to be. And if it works, great. And if not, at least I'll have a really clear understanding of what I think about the industry. And then to my amazement, yeah, the book just took off, and it's been awesome. It's been a ride. I've met a lot of really cool people in the industry, been on some cool podcasts, and I think because I'm trying to think, the last time I was on the show, that was probably right about a year ago from right now. Um, and I've just been meeting people in the industry, trying to put together an idea. I spent a good amount of time trying to build a company, and I think I really quickly came to the idea that on kind of the fun side of things, there's a lot of room for people to be allocating investment to the industry in the right ways, and it's something that I've enjoyed doing. So I've been working towards getting that set up, and hopefully that'll be something that comes next year. And other than that, man, we're still in mom's basement. I'm still holding out and kind of investing a lot of what I have into this idea. And yeah, I'm holding out until I get a little bit more financial security around that end. But that'll probably be a next year thing too, as well. So thanks to mom for holding out with me.
Yeah, and I think you are not in that situation yourself. I think there's a lot of people, specifically the millennial generation. You look like millennial to me. You look like my age, roughly my age. Um, look, the dude, the fact speaks for itself, man. Their own data sees that in the beginning of 2020, the housing prices in the United States just went completely parabolic. And the
Hmm.
reality is that if you're under the age of 35, you're significantly poorer than the generation that came before you. And it's because when they printed all this money, the only people that benefited from it were the financial elites, meaning people that had the means to save in assets, either equities or real estate, therefore benefit from asset inflation. If you were just a regular Joe working for cash, working for fiat, and you didn't have the luxury to put some aside, the reality is that over these last 10 years, when this QE experiment started in 2008, 2009, your future was stolen, your time was stolen from, right? And I think that that's why we're all here. And I know that there's a lot of people in your situation. But anyways, I want to go back to your book, right? It's called The Seventh Property. First of all, it had one of the best explanations for proof of work that I've ever read, and I'm not just saying that because you come on the show. It was extremely well descripted. The first time you came on the show, I had to read it. I was like, dude, this is insane. And it was actually a screenshot from BTC Sessions Ben that pointed it out, and I was like, this is crazy. So, Eric, what is your background, and what originally inspired you to write an entire book? Because that's definitely not an easy undertaking. Like it's not something that you just wake up, you're like, okay, let me write a book, right? It's something that you clearly had to sacrifice time, you had to sacrifice effort in order to do that. So what's your background, and what inspired you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, totally, man. So I come from the traditional finance world. I was working for a private equity fund. And I'd been, when I first heard about Bitcoin, that was in like 2015, and I wrote it off. I didn't understand it very well at all, but I was just like, based on my initial assessment, there's no way I could really value it. And from my background, I had a lot of like this value investing framework. I was a CFA, so a lot of what you learn in that curriculum doesn't really necessarily apply. It's not that it's wrong. It's just you don't no nobody's ever really thought about what makes a monetary good valuable. And so it was a few years, and then I had a friend who was a lot more tech focused, who was like, this thing's really cool, it does cool stuff. And he kind of probed me to start looking into it more. And then once I came around to realizing like, oh, this is a solution to central banking, that's when I was like, okay, this is really interesting to me. I was well aware of all the issues with central banking, and I always had more of like a libertarian view of the world, and believed in free markets. And then once I got hooked, I was spending a lot of my free time just reading about Bitcoin. um, and it was a huge decision for me to jump into all this. I was always very career focused. I Getting a job in private equity, I worked very hard towards starting when I was like a freshman in college. And I was there and I was doing it, and I was like, look, I'm not totally in love with what we're doing. I didn't realize that I wasn't well, I didn't realize going into it that I wasn't quite as passionate about it as I thought I would be. And then like one day it hit me over the head, and I was like, dude, you spent all this time reading about Bitcoin. You should just jump into this industry. And at that time, like I owned my place. And I was kind of like, okay, well, look, if I sell my place and I move back home, I could, that gives me a few years runway to kind of get things figured out. And one day I just decided to say, fuck it, I'm going to jump into the industry and put it together. I think what I wanted to prioritize was, I wanted to do things right. I think that a lot of people, or often I'll see, there's ways to gain a following, and generate revenue that aren't probably good for you in the long term from like a career decision, if you're want to be just like an influencer or something. And like the media side of this was always appealing to me. I feel like often really like analytical people aren't as drawn to media aspects, and that was always something that I felt made me a bit unique. And that I can also do that kind of stuff. I can be a normal dude, have a conversation, as well as get into the weeds around the analytical side. So I was kind of like, okay, that's something I want to do, but how do I really want to do that? And I was like, well, I want to understand this stuff as best as I can. I don't want to go out there and just start talking until I really like actually have my head around it. And step one was really just getting deep into my understanding of Bitcoin and the industry as a whole. I think when I was first heard about Bitcoin, before I jumped into everything, there was a period of time, maybe 6 to 9 months, kind of during the bull run, when I was reading into altcoins, trying to understand it, just like the spider web of knowledge, where when you don't know anything about how this works, the technological aspects are really interesting. It's like, oh, well, Bitcoin uses proof of work. What's proof of stake? What's like, I don't know, there's all these other consensus algorithms I looked into back then. Like there's one called like delegated proof of stake, I think. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I don't really understand it, but it must be superior. And then, I eventually came back around to the idea where I was like, oh, I'm pretty confident in Bitcoin. I was never like, before I jumped into this, I wasn't like a super hardcore maxi or anything. And I'd say I'm still definitely one of the more like moderate, open-minded people, but I'm totally 100% focused on Bitcoin. And I think that, that this is all that matters if we're going to have an immutable base layer to build off a financial system. If you throw that out the window, then none of it matters anymore. But that being said, when I was jumping into it, I was like, okay, well, I need to get as deep as I possibly can in Bitcoin and understand all these aspects. And then, I put together like, back then this was right before, like right at the beginning of 2020. And I put together this curriculum for myself, and that was just places all over on Twitter, different blogs, different books. I actually didn't read really, and there also were a lot less Bitcoin books back then, but I really didn't read many Bitcoin books. The only thing I think I'd only read Bitcoin Standard. Um, there was a textbook by Princeton professor and a few others that was kind of more of a crypto based one that I had read through that was actually really good. There was a lot of interesting. It was called Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Technologies. That was actually really helpful because it was pretty technical, and I like that one. But anyways, there was a lot of different things I wanted to understand. I, being a guy, didn't understand the technology side of the industry that well. I had looked at investments in companies that were, in different areas of tech, but I wasn't an expert on, I didn't understand computers that well at all. And that was kind of one of the areas that I just needed to like build from the bottom up, get a decent understanding of. I'm by no means an expert around any of it, but I needed to kind of build up a base layer of knowledge. And I wanted to get to Jimmy Song's Programming Bitcoin book for my understanding of Bitcoin, because in my old job, if I wanted to understand a company that we were going to buy, in his background, when I was working in my private equity fund, we were a buyout fund. So like what we would do is we'd buy out entire companies, and it's a much more complicated process than just making like a minority investment in something, because there's a lot more that you deal with when you own the entire company. So we'd have very technical due diligence around what we were looking to buy, and I had to understand every aspect of the company that we were going to buy. Um, I wanted to apply that same logic to Bitcoin and be like, okay, well, if I'm, I don't want to just be some finance guy who kind of knows some talking points about Bitcoin. I wanted to get deeper on the technical side and really get under the hood and look at the code and be able to interpret that. So I gave myself kind of like a beginner level Python understanding before I got into that. And then after I'd read like Mastering Bitcoin and a few other things, I did that, and then I was like, okay, I think I have a pretty good understanding of Bitcoin. I, picked around different books around, like Austrian economics, monetary history, monetary theory. Like Nick Szabo's writing was instrumental in helping me really get my head around a lot of that. I had like a high level understanding of it before, but I wanted to get deeper. And then the big thing, particularly back then, that I thought was missing, is not a lot of people were really talking. There's, when the Bitcoin standard came out, people talked about monetary history quite a bit. Not a lot of people were actually talking about how the banking system works, though. And I was like, this is a huge piece. I mean, Bitcoin solves a fundamental issue with money. It also solves the banking system problem. And to really understand money today, you have to understand how the banking system works. Without that, if we were just talking about primitive forms of money, and what was valuable about those, without understanding what's wrong with our current banking system, it's really hard to make a complete argument for Bitcoin's value. So I wanted to get deeper into those areas and just reading old Federal Reserve papers and other more kind of like technical reports. And then yeah, after I kind of went through all that, I was like, look, I need to be writing this stuff down. I had a bunch of notes, but I was like, I need to write it down so I can get a better understanding. And then through that process of just like writing it out, I was like, oh, I could do some blog posts, blah blah blah. Started writing a lot, and then I was like, I'm writing so much here that I guess I could just turn this into a book. And that's kind of how it happened. I was like, I mean, I don't know, I think that there's definitely a need for it and anybody can write a book. And then that led me to the idea of like, well, do I self-publish or publish? And I was kind of like, I'd rather publish it myself, really make it what I want it to be. And if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, it doesn't.